The Gitxsan are a matrilineal system, meaning that family lineage is traced through the mother's bloodline. All Gitxsans are member of a Wilp, or also called a house. There are over 50 Wilps, each having their own territory in the Gitxsan nation. All these houses belong to one of 4 clans: the wolf, the frog, the fireweed, or the eagle. Each house has its own oral history and songs to describe their ancestors and to recall family history. These houses also have jurisdiction over their land and Gitxsan law. Personally, I believe that there is an upward trend in reclaiming the language in the Gitxsan community, as they are incredibly resilient people that are fighting against colonialism and their structures that continue to damage their communities and wish to see the loss of their culture so they are assimilated into the melting pot of Canadian culture. I believe language is an indispensable part of culture and that the Gitxsan community are taking all the right steps to keeping language alive despite all the colonial efforts to impede this. Personally, I believe that there is an upward trend in reclaiming the language in the Gitxsan community, as they are incredibly resilient people that are fighting against colonialism and their structures that continue to damage their communities and wish to see the loss of their culture so they are assimilated into the melting pot of Canadian culture. I believe language is an indispensable part of culture and that the Gitxsan community are taking all the right steps to keeping language alive despite all the colonial efforts to impede this.
With our neighbors, our Aboriginal ways.
The way this nation has chose to be is to have an oral recount of history. The Gitxsans are an oral society. Stories are passed down to explain the ways of life and past events, like picture the story of the long-nosed monster and the youngest son, which explains the way the mosquitoes are and why they drink blood. Storytelling is a very powerful way for children to be taught by their elders and to understand the world around them. Storytelling and songs, oral history, are a huge part of their belief system, as it also pairs up with ceremony. Storytelling was a stylized language that has its own protocol. Each family has its own story to explain their family's past and to tell stories of their ancestors. Every clan has its own version of every story. Each story validates one another because the Gitxsans do not have one single story or song that has a monopoly on understanding. No true being holds the key to everything. Keeping to Wright's paper, she was able to record 2 versions of the origin story. Keep in mind that since this is an oral culture, stories tend to change and complement each other because no one story has a monopoly on truth itself in Gitxsan belief. The legend begins with a village and its inhabitants being destroyed by a neighboring house because of inequality caused by one house being dominant. A raven and her mother were the only 2 survivors. Keeping in mind her goal was to correct the wrongs that had been done to her people, Skawa, through her dreams, tried to find suitors for her daughter. By accomplishing her goal, the ghosts of her relatives would stop drifting like logs in a flood and on the aimless clouds of the air. Her suitors, though presenting many physical strengths, they did not provide the kind of strength she needed, as violations of equity on this planet were many. She needed not only physical strength, but more the strength of the spirit. Finally, after a long search, someone was found. His name was Sunbeam. She married Sunbeam, and through this unity brought 4 sons and 2 daughters, raised by their grandfather, Sun. He gave them each special strengths and provided them for their duty to restore custom and equity in the lawless country on the Sikna. Next origin story starts at the beginning with only one man, thrust out of the womb of the earth, naked and alone. He survived the first winter by covering himself up with dry pine needles, forming a sort of blanket over him, only to awaken during the spring. After coming out of a long hibernation, he felt hunger, so he went to the water and fished with his hands, eating what he caught until he was satisfied. He would go on to make the first pickaxe and begin to build a shelter for himself. After he was done, a supernatural bird, Nesnuk, flew over. Scared, the man fled, but Nesnuk followed and named him Lax. Nesnuk instructed Lax into making fires. He told him that he will bring his sister to help Lax and teach him how to cook meat, fish, and how to dry berries, how to survive winter, amongst other essential surviving skills. Later, when Nesnuk's sister arrived, she crept into Lax's side while he was sleeping, and when he woke, he found the sister in the form of a woman who would bring him comfort and knowledge for the rest of their days. Together, they created children and formed villages, and thus the Gitxsan nation was born.
The scenery.
The language of the Gitxsan nation is Gitxsamia. It falls under Shimshianik, the mother language of the Gitxsan, as well as the Niska. The 2 languages are considered to be different dialects of the same language by linguistics, but because of political reasons, the nations prefer to consider themselves different languages. According to Statistic Canada, there are 1,305 Gitxsans who can speak the language as of 2017. There was a point where the only language spoken on the Gitxsan territory was Sim-Alga, which means the real or true language, whereas now the dominant language is English, which is a direct consequence of colonialism. At residential schools, the children were prohibited from speaking their languages. Present time, there is a large effort for teaching the Gitxsan youth their language. The Sim-Alga Working Group and the University of Northern British Columbia train language teachers. The Gitxsan did a study, and the findings were approximately 70% of the Gitxsan speak their language. This shows that the number of speakers has increased in recent decades. Within the Gitxsan community, there is a Coast Mountain School District number 82 with several First Nations elementary schools and high schools. Personally, I believe that there is an upward trend in reclaiming the language in the Gitxsan community, as they are incredibly resilient people that are fighting against colonialism and their structures that continue to damage their communities and wish to see the loss of their culture, so they are assimilated into the melting pot of Canadian culture. I believe language is an indispensable part of culture, and that the Gitxsan community are taking all the right steps to keeping language alive despite all the colonial efforts to impede this.